The city of Hartford, Connecticut, like too many others across the nation, has suffered the ravages of urban renewal and insensitive redevelopment. Great historic structures have been torn down, and sometimes even whole neighborhoods have been lost. Along Main Street downtown, there are examples of both harsh, brutalist excesses and areas where parking lots have replaced a once dense streetscape. But in this video, we won't be lamenting the many losses, but instead, we're going to celebrate what survives. Main Street, south of the highway down to South Green, still has many great, architecturally significant landmarks that are steeped in Hartford history and continue to stand proudly today. This is History with me, Dan Sterner. If you like this video, consider hitting subscribe as we explore some of the great buildings along Main Street in downtown Hartford. They all date to before the city's big mid-century development projects. I'll talk about larger commercial and residential buildings, soaring office towers, beautiful churches, and stirring public spaces. But let's start with a type of building that once dominated long stretches of Main Street, the single-family home. Hardly any of these survive today downtown, and they've all been repurposed. But there are 3 former residences along the southern part of Main Street that are of great architectural and historical interest. The oldest of these is also the oldest house that survives in Hartford. The Butler McCook House has had many alterations over the years, but its core form is still that of a colonial-type house built in 1782, the year after the American victory at the Battle of Yorktown. Occupied by generations of a family that included medical doctors and Episcopal missionaries, the home's last resident, Frances A. McCook, left her home to become a museum, which is operated by Connecticut Landmarks. Moving to the start of the 19th century, the imposing 3-story Barnard House across from South Green, also called Barnard Park, was built in 1807. It's historically significant because Henry Barnard, a notable education reformer who became the first United States Commissioner of Education in 1867, was born in the house in 1811 and died there in 1900. A little bit further up the street is the impressive Greek Revival-style house built in 1840 for shoe manufacturer Ellery Hills. It stands out for its unusual elliptical portico, which has 4 Ionic columns. Architectural details used on the facade of the house were featured in the book The Builder's Guide, written by Chester Hills and published in Hartford. As the 19th century advanced, downtown Hartford became more built up with commercial and apartment buildings, and these began to replace the earlier houses. Main Street is fortunate to have some notable buildings of this type erected in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The Hotel Capitol at the corner of Main Street and Capitol Avenue is a great representative of Hartford architecture at the start of its Gilded Age heyday. It was built in 1875, the year after Mark Twain built a house in the city. The Hotel Capitol features businesses on the ground level with apartments above, topped by a mansard roof with dormer windows. Above the squared-off corner is a rounded cupola that gives a historic Victorian-era feel to this downtown intersection. Just a few doors down is the McCone Block, built in the same year, 1875, and also of brick. It has an elaborate Italianate-style bracketed rooftop cornice. It's great that this stretch of Main Street evokes the city as it looked in Mark Twain's day. Further up Main Street is the Cheney Block, completed the year after the Hotel Capitol and McCone buildings. It was originally built as the Hartford office building for the Cheney Brothers Silk Manufacturing Company of South Manchester, Connecticut. It's sometimes referred to as the Richardson Building because it was designed by the famous architect H. H. Richardson. It's an early example of his distinctive architectural style called Richardsonian Romanesque, which is characterized by heavy stone construction featuring prominent rounded arches and a strong feeling of monumentality. For many years, the Cheney Building was the home of Hartford's well-remembered Brown-Thompson department store. Richardson's style was very influential. Heading back to the intersection with Capitol Avenue, just north of the Hotel Capitol is the large apartment building called the Linden, which was built in 1891 with an extension added in 1895. The Linden's corner tower evokes the similar tower on the Hotel Capitol, but the massiveness and use of heavy stonework on the Linden reflects a shift in architectural taste towards the monumentality of the Richardsonian Romanesque. From the late 1890s into the 1920s, as commercial and office buildings began to grow larger and taller, the neoclassical and colonial revival styles came to dominate architectural tastes. For example, built in 1921 was the Hartford, Connecticut Trust Company building at the corner of Central Row. And then, of course, there's Hartford's iconic skyscraper, Travelers Tower, designed by Don Barber and completed in 1919. While many buildings continued the pattern of having ground floor retail with offices or apartments above, some larger department stores grew to occupy entire multi-story buildings. Designed by Isaac A. Allen Jr., the facade of the Sage Allen Building, with its many Beaux-Arts elements, survives today, incorporated into a modern apartment building. Across the street, the former Wise Smith department store, later a branch of Corvette's, once occupied its entire large building, but the structure now follows the more typical pattern of having businesses on the ground floor and apartments above. Hartford's most famous department store, G. Fox & Company, occupied a huge building designed by the prominent architect Cass Gilbert. Used today by Capital Community College, the G. Fox building still has its signature Art Deco-style marquee added in the 1930s. Before I get to Main Street's notable public and institutional buildings, let's consider houses of worship. The same shift I've mentioned earlier in architectural styles is reflected in the 6 church buildings located along Main Street south of I-84. The delicacy of the Federal style, which flourished at the start of the 19th century, is represented by the delicate profusion of columns and dentil moldings that create the wedding cake steeple of Center Congregational Church, built in 1807. According to tradition, the steeple was designed by Daniel Wadsworth, the founder of the nearby Wadsworth Atheneum Museum of Art. Built 20 years later, South Congregational Church has a simpler steeple reflecting the growing influence of the Greek Revival style. As the 19th century progressed, Romantic Revival styles came to dominate church architecture. The oldest Gothic-style church on Main Street is also one of the oldest Gothic-style churches in the United States. Christ Church was consecrated in 1829 and is now the cathedral of the Episcopal Diocese of Connecticut. The church was designed by the important New Haven architect Ithiel Town. Towards the south end of Main Street is a stone-built Gothic church designed by James Murphy of Providence. Built in 1868, St. Peter's Catholic Church is the oldest surviving Catholic church in the city of Hartford. But when it was first built, the church did not have a completed corner tower. This was not uncommon at the time, when parishes sometimes waited until funds became available to complete a church building. It wasn't until 60 years after the church first opened, in the 1920s, that the tower was finally completed. Initially, it was Catholic and Episcopal parishes that favored Gothic-style churches, but eventually other denominations commissioned buildings in the Gothic style. The former South Park Methodist Church, built in 1875 on the west side of Maine, has elements of both the Romanesque and Gothic Revival styles. The youngest church building on Main Street downtown is the Central Baptist Church, built just under a century ago in 1926. It replaced the earlier South Baptist Church on that site, which was an Italianate-style structure built in the 1850s. The current church's Greek temple-style portico and Ionic columns represent the return to classical models. Even with the popularity of the neoclassical style, the Gothic Revival style continued to be popular for certain types of buildings. A few blocks south of the church is the South Green Fire Station, built in 1927, just a year after the Baptist Church. It has many Gothic features, such as pointed arches above the doors of its apparatus bays, an oriel window, and a crenellated rooftop. A similar sequence of architectural styles is represented by the grand structures of the Wadsworth Athenaeum and the neighboring City Hall. Founded in 1842 by Daniel Wadsworth, the Wadsworth Athenaeum is the oldest continuously operating art museum in the United States. The facade of the Athenaeum's original castle-like Gothic building, which opened in 1844, survives today as one of Hartford's most distinctive landmarks. Its design was the work of Alexander Jackson Davis and Ithiel Town, who designed Christ Church Cathedral. The Athenaeum had a number of additions in the 20th century, and their varied architecture reflects changing tastes. Focusing on the buildings along Main Street, connecting on the south side of the castle is the Colt Memorial Building, erected in 1906 and designed by Benjamin Wistar Morris. Like the South Green Fire Station, it has an oriel window and the kind of intricate detailing influenced by collegiate Gothic styles that were popular in the early 20th century. The Colt Memorial connects to the larger Morgan Memorial Building, which was a gift of the financier J.P. Morgan, who was born in Hartford and donated the building in memory of his father. The Morgan Memorial was designed by Lafarge and Morris in the Beaux-Arts style, using many classical decorative motifs. Dedicated in 1910, the building was being expanded east to Prospect Street in 1913 at the time of J.P. Morgan's death. Just a few years later, another substantial Beaux-Arts building was erected just next door, Hartford's Municipal Building, or City Hall, designed by Davison Brooks. The entrance that faces Main Street is highly ornamented, but just as detailed inside is the building's beautiful atrium, which looks today much as it did when the building was completed in 1915. City Hall was officially called the Municipal Building because over 100 years ago, when it was built, another building was known to everyone as City Hall. This was the old State House, which had served as City Hall after the new State Capitol building opened in 1878. The architecture of the old State House, which was designed by the famous Thomas Bulfinch, takes us back to the earlier classicism of the Federal period. Contrary to what you might expect, the side of the old State House that faces Main Street is not the main entrance. It's actually the back of the building. Instead, the front facade faces east towards the Connecticut River. That's because when it opened in 1796, the river served as the Grand Highway, bringing people to the city. From the ferry landing, they would then head up State Street and past the State House, reaching Main Street beyond. We can be grateful today that, despite the extensive use of the wrecking ball in the city of Hartford, many great examples of its architectural history do survive along Main Street today. Check out some of my videos about what used to exist in downtown Hartford, and thanks for watching.